Good afternoon. It is October 16th at 12 p.m. Central Time, and this is our webinar, Cybersecurity in MedTech. My name is Michael Felice, and I'll be our host for this webinar. And we are excited to have three great panelists talking around cybersecurity and MedTech. Before we get started, this webinar is brought to you by Pulse Forward. Pulse Forward is a medical engineering consulting services organization with tons of engineers to solve your medical device problems. That's Pulse Forward, solving engineering problems around medical device. All right. Now I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Nadim and have him do a quick introduction of himself.
Hi, yeah, my name is Nadim Schwen, and I'm an attorney and shareholder at the law firm Winthrop and Weinstein. My practice of law focuses on kind of the intersection of technology and law. I focus on cybersecurity, privacy, and intellectual property. My previous career was in and training was in computer engineering, so those are the things that interest me and what I do today and why I've encountered a lot of medical device issues, particularly on the cybersecurity side.
Thanks, Nadim. Nick, can you go next?
Absolutely. My name is Nick Gillespie. I am the founder and principal consultant at Logic Hazard Labs. I have been in the offensive security and penetration testing space for about the greater of close to 12 years now. A lot of that time has been spent hacking medical devices and helping medical device manufacturers and healthcare providers close those gaps and deploy the technology of tomorrow securely. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Nick. And Brian.
I've worked my career in product development side on medical devices, active implantable medical devices and active medical devices, and software and systems engineering. And as part of that, I've also done cybersecurity work, focusing on threat modeling and the development life cycle.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, and thanks to all of you. We are excited about this conversation. I think it's very timely. And before we jump in, we wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit about where cybersecurity is in the medtech and medical device space. Over the past few years, I think the medtech industry as a whole has seen a major shift in terms of cybersecurity no longer just being an IT issue, but rather a core part of patient safety and regulatory compliance. So with the rise of connected devices, with the FDA pre-market guidance and increase in scrutiny around SBOMs and transparent and software transparency, the stakes have never been higher for us to really think about cybersecurity. Organizations are starting to redesign, test, and monitor, not only to protect intellectual property, but to safeguard patients and maintain trust. So today, our panel is going to really explore how companies can move from sort of reactive fixes to more of a secure by design mindset, integrating cybersecurity into every phase of the product lifecycle. So that's kind of the general stage, and wanted to kind of get some perspectives from the three of you. Brian, if you could kind of kick us off on sort of your perspective on the state of cybersecurity in medtech today.
Yeah, what's happened in the last decade is use of more wireless and interconnected devices, and so that's led to a lot more data sharing, and that's led to medical devices that are made up of multiple parts in larger systems that are all sharing data with each other and individually all potential targets for cybersecurity. So there's just this increase in connectivity has led to more of a focus on cybersecurity by the FDA. And so in 2023, they released their new cybersecurity guidance that really changed the way that FDA looked at cybersecurity. And they also recently updated that guidance in June of 2025.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Nadim, can we get your thoughts as well?
And why the topic matters?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly it's always mattered to a certain degree, but what I've seen, particularly with the you know, explosion of Gen AI over the last few years, is incorporation of all sorts of, I would say, more at-risk software and hardware medical devices on the market, whether it be some medical advice providing LLM or some other integration of automated decision making within devices. So there's just a lot more going on, a lot more breaking and getting past, I think, quality control and regulators as well. And the lawmakers are scrambling to keep up and passing all sorts of new laws, including one relevant one that just got proposed anyways yesterday at the federal level, or a few days ago. And yeah, it's just generated a lot of activity and focus and interest.
No, thanks, Nadeem. Nick, any thoughts as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the threat landscape has changed an awful lot in the past 25 years or so. Back in the early 2000s, FDA actually considered the risk of unplanned software updates to be significantly greater than malware running in, for example, the manufacturing lines for medical devices. Then over the years, ransomware started to develop where there is this financially motivated set of threat actors that see value in interrupting the flow of something critical to our daily lives, like medical supplies, or even worse, potentially looking at targeting the devices themselves within the healthcare delivery organizations and disrupting healthcare operations. So that changing threat landscape sort of changed the agency's calculus and gave rise to a lot of these regulatory changes and legal changes that Brian and Nadeem outlined. So as the adversaries kind of take steps forward, we need to try to stay one step ahead of them, both in the blue team side of things, where we're designing devices that are robust and safe, but also from our efforts to emulate what they do and predict where their next move is going to be.
Awesome. No, thanks, Nick. I appreciate it. The the next thing we wanted to kind of dive into a little bit more specifically is a little bit of the idea of building versus buying and some of the risks that go into those. Brian, did you want to start us off with this?
Yeah, so we were talking about build versus buy with threat modeling and SBOMs as specific points of interest. And it's interesting that the tool, there's a lot of cybersecurity tools out there right now. And on the SBOM side, I think there's a lot of tools to buy. And in fact, I think it's the right thing to buy versus build, but I'll go into that a little bit more. And then on the threat modeling side, I think it's interesting that there are some tools out there, and they're even free tools, but a lot of the time, I've found, and I know some other threat modelers find that it's just using paper or the next best thing, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, are great tools. So the neat thing about threat modeling is that it is an exercise that you can just do on paper. But the problem with paper is that it's less maintainable. So you can kind of take a step back and do that in PowerPoint and Word or Excel. And then you have obviously assets you can continue to maintain going forward. But there are some neat tools out there like OWASP Threat Dragon, Microsoft Threat Modeler that walk you through the process. Microsoft Threat Modeler has a limitation not running on the Mac, and but otherwise it's it's still a tool that many people use. What's really interesting, I think, or what's potentially interesting in the future is where some of the tools are going. And there's been some starts at this, but I think speculate a little bit what some future tools and more automation could look like in threat modeling tools. A lot of current tools maybe give you some templates to fill out, and that can be useful with infrastructures like Azure and AWS that have a lot of security configuration settings, and so it can help you think through those. But what I think I could see coming in the future that would be interesting is being able to generate just say specs and markdown, and having a tool that would analyze those specs. Maybe maybe an LLM would be involved, or maybe just against databases, but bringing in the threats, connecting your uh, architecture. So your markdown might lay out your architecture, then connecting that to something like OAuth top 10 or other known threat lists. So, and there are some tools that have kind of dabbled in that, and there's still some in development. But that's where I think there could be some future opportunity. On the SBOM side, I think there you have a much more automated problem to solve, or much more automatable problem to solve. So you really, there are some great tools out there that can review your dependency lists in your software. So maybe I should back up a minute and just review. An SBOM is a software bill of materials, and so it lists out all the software packages that are in your software's product, software's medical device, um, and what it tries to do is connect them to. It obviously takes the software package, the version, and it connects it to CVEs in the CVE database. And so it's a very automatable process where you want the tool to go in, scan that dependency list, and scan for what are transitive dependencies. So dependencies of those dependencies might have, and then connect those back to the CVEs, and then surface those CVEs and try to reduce noise. So I think there's great tools on the market, and I wouldn't want to build my own with that. I think that's an expensive process, but I do see that there's opportunities for a hybrid approach. So sometimes we'll get some legacy code bases, and those might not be using package managers, and so we might write some tools that can automatically determine or extract what those packages are, and then feed them into some of these off-the-shelf tools that can then generate the SBOM. And actually another piece of that SBOM tool is that it's going to generate them in the formats that the FDA wants them in, which is the SPDX or the Cyclone DX formats. So those are just some of my thoughts on build versus buy for threat modeling and SBOM.
Thanks, Brian. Nadeem, I know you had some thoughts around the integration and liability.
Yeah, whenever my clients are thinking about, do we buy something off the shelf? Usually that's a lot assumedly closer to ready to go versus build something. The questions that I chime in about are well, less the practical, like how long is it going to take, and more, well, what are the actual risks that you're incurring with either one of those decisions? And ideally, obviously, you can reduce cybersecurity risk with your own build as long as you have the expertise in-house to hit industry level standards, and also make it more customizable to whatever your specific needs are versus something off the shelf, which may or may not have the access controls granularity that you might otherwise need. We've seen cybersecurity incidents a lot of the time where something was purchased off the shelf and might have had robust security, but it didn't have the access control that was needed, and therefore there was an additional legal risk. And of course, if you're buying something off the shelf, you can get some assurance with the brand and the reputation of the company, but their agreements will very frequently, unless they're pretty shrewdly negotiated, push all the liability onto you anyways. And so you have to be careful about that kind of illusion of safety from a liability perspective when there's really an agreement that says no matter what goes wrong, it's your fault. That's why vendor risk management and kind of making sure you're working with reputable and companies that are actually able to deliver you what you need, as well from a liability standpoint, as well as a technical standpoint. And compliance obviously is a big question there. All sorts of vendors are certified or not certified on HIPAA high tech kind of level services. They always have some major upcharge. but making sure you know that it's not some some shop that's basically saying, well, we're not going to certify that it's to HIPAA standards, but we basically can do the same thing and promise you that, in emails, but not necessarily actually be able to deliver something that's compliant. And now it's integrated in your product, and you've got all sorts of issues down the road, and it's too late. So yeah, focusing on what your needs are and marrying the agreement to it, as well as finding the right partner, all very important.
Hey, Nadeem, real quick, just for anyone in the audience that may not know, could you define what those acronyms are at the bottom of the integration and liability section?
Yeah, HIPAA obviously is health insurance portability. I gotta look it up. I always forget. I just know that you don't put two P's in HIPAA, which we see all the time. And MSA and BA are master services agreements, so that'll be the main terms and conditions you're signing up for on a software development agreement, or just principal agreement. And then the business associate agreements are a requirement under HIPAA whenever you're working with a vendor, to make sure that all of the obligations that might fall on you, the company that's hiring the vendor, that you push them down to the obligations to maintain security and privacy of HIPAA, PHI, protected health information, when you are working on something that is covered by HIPAA, or might be covered by HIPAA by whoever your ultimate customer is. So yeah, and HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act.
Awesome. No, thank you for the quick Googling there as well. As a kid from Bloomington, I just know BA used to always stand for Bloomington Athletic Association. So, but that's a kid from Bloomington, Minnesota, and me from the 1980s. Anyways, Nick, any concluding thoughts on this slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So to maybe expand a little bit on what Brian was saying about threat modeling, I think one of the important things to consider when threat modeling is that FDA cares very deeply about the process you're using for a threat model. Now, technology can sometimes have certain process integrations where you might have a workflow in a certain piece of software where you go through one screen, then the next screen, then the next. But that's really what the FDA often is scrutinizing when they're taking a look at your threat model. Did your process thoroughly examine all components of this system for potential threats that could lead to patient harm or other cybersecurity harms? Now, there's a lot of process in regulation that sort of says, hey, we're going to also separate cybersecurity risks from patient safety risk, but that's maybe a little bit outside the scope of what a threat model needs to be. At its core, the threat model needs to define sort of what the components are in your system, what the interactions will be between those components, where the assets like the data, the authentication credentials, the therapies and medicines, for example, that a medical device might administer to a patient. All of these things need to be captured in that threat model. And a lot of these off-the-shelf sort of tools are likely not going to be customized to the medical device world. So you're going to need to modify your process, regardless of your technology, to sort of include that in order to get what the FDA is really looking for there. So what I would just say is maybe take a look at a couple of resources that are out there. FDA kind of signed on to a MITRE publication a couple of years ago that talks about a framework for threat modeling medical devices. One thing that framework does say is that there is more than one way to threat model, and I'm a firm believer in that. But it does give sort of an intro to sort of the core concepts that are common among threat models. So definitely look into that as an example of what good can look like from a threat modeling perspective. There are some more recent threat modeling frameworks that are out there including another collaboration involving MITRE and I believe the folks from Red Balloon. They did a framework called Embed that is often used for embedded devices, and that may apply to a lot of medical devices as well. Even though you do have software as a medical device in there, you might be able to borrow some of the concepts. So definitely take a look at all of the different frameworks and resources that are out there before sort of deciding what an organization like yourself would need to implement. Other than that, I would say consistency and process is going to be your most important part of threat modeling in this context. And you can do that with technology, you can do that with PowerPoint, you can do that with a whiteboard. It just needs to be defined, and you need to be able to justify later why you think that this is thorough, why you think that this is producing what the FDA would refer to as a scientifically refutable threat model. On the SBOM side, I would also echo that there are a lot of standards out there that relate to software bill of materials. Cyclone DX and SPDX are pretty mature at this point. There are a number of industries looking to implement software bill of materials as requirements. So not only the medical device sector, but also the transportation sector. Starting to see that a little bit kind of in the telecommunications sector as well. So all of that is to say that there are a lot of resources already out there for you to use. And I highly recommend that you continue to review those resources as well as you make your decisions.
Thanks, Nick. As we were kind of just to kind of transition as to what Nick was saying on MITRE, we'll kind of get into a little bit of a deeper dive now on threat modeling. Brian, can you kick us off?
Yeah, actually, I think what Nick said was well said and captured a lot of it. The FDA had, so Nick was already talking to us about the MITRE playbook, and when the FDA put out its 2023 standard, they also were, I don't know if realized or perhaps just concerned or just trying to help manage help companies out, but they realized that MITRE that threat modeling might not be a something that everyone is familiar with, and so they commissioned MITRE to put together that playbook. That is a great resource for teaching about threat modeling, and not just threat modeling, but then the larger cybersecurity process. And then with the 2025 standard being released, the ANSI SW96 standard is now identified, and the ANSI, this standard is it's a bit like so for somebody like me who's on the system engineering product development side, we use the 14791 risk standard a lot, and so this ANSI SW96 is a little bit like that risk standard for threat modeling. So after you develop the threat model, and Nick talked about this a little bit, but after you develop the threat model, then we assess those risks. And this standard has good guidance on how to identify, how to characterize exploitability of risk, because risks they're not driven by, say, random failures as product risk management might be. They're driven by an attacker's desire to exploit vulnerabilities, and that desire is going to be, and the standard even goes into what that desire might be motivated by. Is it a target attack or not? So these are great standards. These are great resources, similar to what Nick was already saying. As again, Nick alluded to, there's a lot of different ways to do threat modeling. Probably the most maybe I shouldn't say most, but a very straightforward, very common method is to use the STRIDE methodology. STRIDE is an acronym. STRIDE was developed at Microsoft initially. It's an acronym that stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And, or, maybe escalation of privilege. It's kind of both get used. The what this is a list of cybersecurity characteristics to think about with each potential vulnerability or each interface with, or as Nick said, in regards to your assets. So spoofing, can you pretend to be somebody else? And authentication is your username and login is a common form of authentication. That's a one technique for mitigating spoofing. So that's an important technique, and I've used that a lot. Attack trees are another interesting technique, and they're, again, if you're coming from the medical device risk management background, attack trees are similar to fault trees, but for threat modeling. Those get used less often, but they can be useful tools for developing an understanding of where attacks could be coming from. And that's also kind of similar to the risk side on products. FMEAs are maybe the more common and widely used risk management tool. But fault trees are maybe a little bit less used, but they're still useful for, they can still be very useful for identifying risks in a product. And so attack trees are sort of similar in the same way, I've found.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, sure.
Brian, can you also just what does MVP stand for?
Yeah, so MVP is a common term in startups for a minimum viable product, and so there's an interesting question down here. If you're developing a minimum viable product, then you have a minimum budget. You're trying to get something out there, trying to show it to investors. And so the question is, the question on the slide is, would you do threat modeling for your MVP? So, I'll put that in a little context of the FDA. The FDA, with these guidances, is really focused on and trying to bring focus to how security needs to be built in and not bolted on. And it's actually terms that they use. They use the bolted on term in their guidance. So the idea just being that, and then you also hear this referred to as shift left. Just do the threat modeling up front so you understand where your risks are, so then you can design the mitigations from the beginning, rather than trying to come back and mitigate it later on when you might not have the time or the money, or it might be too late, or the architecture may already be set in ways that make it difficult for you to fix. So do you threat model your MVP? Ideally, yes, and the FDA would encourage that. And those threat models could be very, very simple. I mean, if you're doing a web app, a web server with a mobile app to track, health metrics, then you're going to be looking at how you're storing the data. Are you encrypting the data between the mobile app and the web server? How are you authenticating the mobile app? So these are pretty common, and these are pretty common problems that we solve anyway. And if you're going to have to go to the FDA, then you're going to want to have that model. But on the other hand, if you're building an MVP, you might not be ready to go to the FDA with it. You might be just trying to elicit investor behavior. It might be planning that you have to do re-architecture after the fact. So there is something to consider how much threat modeling you do, but it's still an important exercise to help you think about security from the beginning and help you make that plan.
Thanks, Brian. Nick, I know you had already talked a little bit about this, but anything to add on to this slide as well?
Yeah. Just one thing that sort of comes to mind when taking a look at the bullet points up there, when to threat model a pre-market versus post-market. Really, the answer to that is yes. You do need to threat model pre-market, because that's really when you are building your system, you're defining your controls, you're making sure that this device that you are putting out into the world is robust enough to withstand the current threat environment. But that threat environment changes over time. Unlike your product, which you may prefer, um, remain static because it does its job, it does its job well. But unfortunately, new classes of attack are coming out all the time. Threat actors have different motivators. They're developing new techniques. Um, there's potential that new technologies could enable threats that were considered impractical during your initial threat modeling. So that threat model should be a dynamic, it should be a living document that you are using to maintain your product security in post-market, even if that snapshot of the threat model that you're attaching to your 510K submission in eStar is sort of considering this is what we've thought of up until this point. And keep in mind that that 510K process, that's going to apply whenever you're making a significant enough change to your medical device. So if you're adding new functionality, then the FDA is going to take a look at all of these same cybersecurity controls and say, has this new feature gone through all of your other steps and processes like threat modeling, penetration testing, all the rest of it. So it's not a once and done kind of deal. It needs to be built in not only to the product, but it needs to be built into your organization and needs to be part of your process and part of your quality system.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Nick.
I should just reiterate that. So yeah, after you've put the product out there, you might be doing more penetration tests, SBOM assessment, or what we call SCA, software component analysis, which generates the SBOM. And you might identify vulnerabilities, and then you need to bring those vulnerabilities back into the threat model. And so yeah, just reiterating what Nick said.
Awesome. Nadeem, any final thoughts on this slide?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we've definitely emphasized what I was mostly going to focus on, which was start early and review and keep it revised early and often. There's particularly been a lot of work that we've done with all the new regulations that keep coming out and ensuring that, for example, your incident response plan that would spring off of your threat model is aligned with the latest of the 19, for example, state privacy laws that came out, plus all the new international regulations that are focusing on, cybersecurity in medical devices and making sure they engage early and often with legal, so that if something horrible happened, you have to report to FDA, you have to report to attorneys general around the US, or they have, some other federal authorities, that the plan, that nobody's trying to figure out what the plan should be. It's already up to date.
That's great. Our next slide, because in the last year or so, we can't have a webinar without a little bit of AI in it, is just to talk a little bit about this. Brian, did you want to kind of kick us off just at a very high level about AI in cybersecurity and medical devices?
Yeah, so when we look at how do you attack AIs, the main or some of the main risks, I guess I'd say, are poisoning the AI and extracting data from the AI. So, and then here we've got some specific versions of poisoning. And what I would do is, when I'm looking at these from a threat modeling side, these I tie these into the stride model. I mean, so poisoning AI is about tampering with the data that is going into the model. So that's the T in stride. And usually, to be able to tamper with that data, you're also going to have to get past authentication hurdles. And so there's a spoofing side and elevation privilege side involved with poisoning. And on the extraction side, this is pulling data out of the model. You might be able to do that by, if it's an LLM, you ask questions and you get information back that maybe what they did wasn't intended to come back. With other types of AIs you could be introduced. You could potentially extract patient information with proper queries. So this gets in again. This is the information disclosure side. If I'm modeling, if I'm doing this with Stride threat modeling, this would be information disclosure of the I in Stride. Um, but again, you're gonna have to get past whatever protections have been put in place. So you'll have some spoofing and elevation privilege might come in there. Actually with poisoning, there might also be a repudiation, the R in Stride, because there you would you would like to protect those models with logs or transactional information that indicates who loaded the information. So that'd be another area that you need to protect, or that you consider protecting the AI.
Nick or Nadeem, any additional thoughts on this? Nadeem, I know you've had a lot of experience around AI.
Yeah, and I think that we'll be talking about a little bit more on the next slide, but with respect to specifically the cybersecurity issues as well as some of the ethical concerns list, yeah, I mean, my experience is that regulators like the FDA and legislators that are lawmaking in the space are just trying to figure it out, like a lot of the companies that are experimenting with the technologies. And I think that that makes a pretty ripe environment for risk, because today many of the risks of even pretty well known LLMs that might be combined with existing software or play some role in a provision of care that somewhere in the chain could be exploited in ways that we can't possibly predict today. So early testing, documentation of the testing, and constant ongoing monitoring from a security and output perspective is some of the things that I am constantly counseling my clients to consider, and then again document so that you can, something will go wrong eventually, but you can point and say we did reasonable things to get ahead of the risk of that happening.
Thanks, Nadeem. That's great.
Just one thing that I would put in there as well, and this is not quite hot off the press, but fairly recent. Anthropic did release some research that showed that even when you have a fairly large model, like a 13 billion or so parameter model, all it takes to get meaningful poisoning from that is the ability to modify about 250 documents that are used in the training. So I think that so much is yet to be known about the mechanics of large language models and other forms of AI, that we're going to continue to see kind of what the security envelope is of these technologies in the coming years. I would just advise, if you are considering putting AI, whether it's large language model or computer vision classification, or even anything generative, absolutely keep an eye on what the latest security research is around AI and machine learning, because like many of the evolving threats of, say, the 20 teens, how defacements became ransomware, become the scourge that we have today. I think that AI/ML is going to start to follow a similar path, where we start to see sort of what the limitations are of the technology. We see people start to push those limits, and then we start to see sort of industrial scale exploitation of weaknesses in those core tech aspects.
Yeah, I mean, and just to jump in there, as you were talking, that also reminds me of it's not an asymmetric challenge, because obviously we've seen a lot of threat actors utilize AI to broaden the scope and impact of what they might be doing to exploit known known attack vectors, or the new ones that are revealed because of artificial intelligence. And it's not just moving the grammar of phishing emails, but really kind of some of them are quite sophisticated, particularly when they're the state actors.
Great points. I think one of the next thing that Nadim had alluded to is that just talking about integrating into a product lifecycle, which to me can bring in lots of risk. Brian, did you want to start us off talking about this again?
Yeah. So yeah, our first bullet, we talked about this a little bit earlier with the SBOMs and the threat modeling. So when we look at this, Nick said it well earlier. We're putting together, and the FDA guidance actually lists this out. We're putting together these couple acronyms: TPLC and SPDF. So TPLC is the total product life cycle, and the software development life cycle is a piece of that. And then the SPDF is a secure product development framework. And so that's sort of your plan for how you're doing security in your total product life cycle. So when we look at this first bullet, the idea is that you would do your threat modeling up front. You do your testing with what we call SAST and DAST testing, so static analysis testing, where software tools review your code and identify through their databases, tie that back to common weaknesses, common vulnerabilities, and then bring those up so that developers can see them and execute. Or sorry, I was watching the slideshow move. So the developers can see those and fix them. So you do that testing, then you're gonna follow on with penetration testing. And they've got the SBOM generation that we're talking about, the SCA software component analysis that generates the SBOMs. It's again, it's going to look at the packages, identify vulnerabilities. So you find those, you fix those, you release that into the market. You're going to monitor. You do some monitoring, something like an SEIM system, which will be looking at logs, looking at data, intrusion detection systems, and also just your standard post-market surveillance activities, or how are the devices acting, where are the failure modes, what are the causes of those failure modes. You pull that back you look at that information for further vulnerabilities, and you're going to pull that back in again on the next release of software. Or in fact, as Nick described earlier, in the 2000s, software updates were considered to be higher risk than the malware. So with the 2023 and 2025 cybersecurity guidance, actually software updatability, as they call it, is a priority. So they expect you to be able to update your software often. So you'll take all these information, you're going to be putting out a new software release, and so you're going to go through that process again of SAS testing, DAST testing, if it's to the extent that it's automated. You might do some manual. Sometimes there's some manual DAST testing. Pen testing, Nick can probably talk about that more, but that gets, I guess what I've seen is that gets repeated maybe less often. You're not able to automate that as much. But you're still going to do that on a regular cadence. So I've actually, what I was trying to do is provide a little background into that process that the FDA is expecting now. That's a continuous process. And even though the first bullet really talks about more just the SBOM and the threat modeling, I hope I outlined where those fit into the process.
Thanks, Brian. Nick, did you want to talk a little bit about the penetration testing on that?
Yeah, 100%. So penetration testing is sort of a unique aspect of security testing. You know, a lot of the testing that we talk about with medical devices is going to be, you know, sort of this pass fail, almost like V&V testing, verification and validation. You know, does the product meet this requirement, and is this requirement reasonable for what the product is expected to do? Penetration testing isn't necessarily pass fail, because no matter how you design a product, there's going to be a certain amount of residual risk. What penetration testing is about is seeing how your product stands up to um, real world conditions, even from skilled and motivated threat actors. So to that end, you're never going to be able to completely automate pen testing. To Brian's point, it is a little bit more manual. It does require somebody who is experienced to have hands-on, even if you are using tools as part of the penetration testing process that are heavily automated. You know, it does take experience to interpret those results, put them together into something that forms an exploit chain, like a threat actor ordinarily would. You know, there are some beginnings of AI platforms that are starting to do things like um, bug bounty, bug hunting, very, very capably. Um, but again, those tools are focused more on the technical aspects of it, you know, sort of less aware of how your technology fits into the healthcare environment. So automation is a little bit more difficult to fit into the pen testing framework. Now, I will say that FDA has said on public calls that they kind of want to see an 18-month freshness date on your penetration testing. And the reason for that is because, as we talked about before, um, you know, the threat environment changes over time. So if you design your device according to what exists in October of 2025, when January of 2027 rolls around, the attackers may have new tools in their tool belt. And if you still have devices out in your fleet deployed, which you probably do, a lot of medical devices will stay in the field for you know, 5, 6, 10 years conservatively. Then you need to be able to keep up with them, and you need to be able to defend against those tools. And penetration testing, therefore, is expected to happen periodically, even though hopefully, since you've done it once before, you can leverage some of those learnings from the first time. Any automation, I think, would fall, you know, sort of more, as Brian said, you know, on the SBOM and vulnerability scanning part, which is a separate activity that is laid out by the guidance.
Thanks, Nick. No, I think there's definitely an art and a science to that effort. Nadeem, any final thoughts on some of the liabilities and when it comes to integration?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're starting without a mature bill of materials, I mean, you're already out of compliance with DA, and you know, if you're awaiting sign off, just approval, then you could delay that or stop that from happening. If we're in a post-market kind of situation, then you are looking at likely enforcement if they can show you didn't do or didn't have some basic threat modeling ahead of time, if that was the cause. Obviously, if something bad has happened, and then you can't kind of show your notes because you can never really predict, you know, 12 months out, let alone 18 months out, what the new kind of threats are going to be, depending on what sort of, you know, space that you're actually operating in. So it's product liability. You could have HIPAA issues. If any sort of disclosure of information is involved due to, for example, a basic instead of mature bill of materials that led to some sort of data leak. And then I guess probably, yeah, just operational overall, because that incident planning that I was talking about integrates pretty tightly as like an ongoing part of the living set of documents that need to be maintained if you've got something out there in the market or awaiting approval.
Thanks, Nadeem.
I would just jump in there as well. And Brian and Nadeem, feel free to keep me honest here. But I believe that, for example, if you don't really have the baseline for a threat model in your submission in your 510K as well, one possible consequence of that will be your submission being deemed not substantially equivalent. Or FDA comes back with your original submission and says, hey, there's a deficiency here, and they're going to give you a time clock to fix that. In which case, kind of doing those activities and any repeat activities within that window could absolutely be challenging from a practical, financial, and business perspective.
Yeah, I mean,
that's
absolutely.
exactly right.
I've actually got a client that's awaiting the government to start back up because they are expecting a not substantial equivalence finding, and they're wondering if that could have played a role, the threat modeling component, because of this particular product. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, I was saying exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, so the projects I've worked on, we've provided those threat models, so we haven't come back with that severe of a communication from the FDA, but we have been asked by BSI and FDA about our threat models, and for example, are you assessing the probability, and we'll talk about the exploitability versus probability. So just highlighting the importance of having those threat models and actually all the security deliverables that are identified in the FDA guidance for your submission activities.
No, great points. Brian, did you want to continue us on here with some of the regulatory expectations?
Yeah, it's almost like we planned that transition to this slide. So the key. So we're just talking about this. So I'm just repeating myself. The FDA guidance is they lay out what they expect to see, and that includes threat model, includes security views, or security architecture views. Sorry. It also includes a sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts. Also includes a cybersecurity management plan, which I think Nadeem was talking about having plans in place ahead of time. The cybersecurity management plan and this kind of gets a little bit to that first question, how do you prepare for cybersecurity review? You start with the cybersecurity management plan because that lays out how you're going to be managing your cybersecurity in your product life cycle. And that's going to establish that you're doing the testing, that you're doing the monitoring, your post-market surveillance process. And then the FDA guidance also lays out your threat modeling and architecture views. It lays out your the requirements on risk assessments as well. And then going back, if I dance back and forth between that first question, if we're working on the cybersecurity review, we're going to be providing, or the cybersecurity review, we're providing those threat models and architecture views. And then we're going to be, the other thing we'll do to help prepare for that is make sure we're creating these testing workflows for the software teams. So all this automation we're talking about on the previous slide, setting up that SAST workflow, for example. When are you going to run that in terms of your process? How are you going to identify those vulnerabilities, fix those vulnerabilities, summarize the findings, do risk assessments on any outstanding findings. So the FDA guidance covers this, and these are things that we do to prepare for the cybersecurity review. These other standards, or this SW96 standard we also talked about earlier, that provides, again, a lot of instruction on how to do threat modeling, the risk assessment of findings that might come out of your threat modeling or come out of your testing. And then on the European side, you have these other standards, the ISO 81001 and the EU's MFCG. And those are still developing, and BSI expects, or whoever your notified body is, going to expect the similar materials that FDA guidance does, and that those standards ask for.
Nick or Nadeem, any additional thoughts?
I mean, I guess, yeah, just to take the legal piece of that, that's sort of showing, like, we're seeing globally a convergence of issues. Specifically, I would say AI, cybersecurity, for example, in medical devices, independent, more on the regulatory, like medical device regulatory side, as well as data protection and privacy laws. And increasingly seeing inter-referrals between those laws and putting more like affirmative requirements rather than voluntary obligations internationally, and all of their standards are a little bit different. So you can't just go FDA only anymore. Practically, what that means and what we're seeing is this kind of like ongoing, atypical for the traditional medical device regulatory route, like a data protection impact assessment workflow that kind of lives alongside any new feature development, any new product launch, and any new risk that develops related to kind of data protection and privacy issues because of these huge expansive laws like the GDPR that are now out there that still do have to be looked at closely if you're launching anywhere other than the United States. And even if you are in the United States, if you're looking at some of the state laws. So yeah, I would say a convergence of those things is kind of a practical takeaway.
Yeah, and what I'll also kind of throw on there follows on with what Brian introduced there with the cybersecurity management plan. One of the expectations that FDA really has tried to communicate is that you need to patch your devices when they're in the field. They need to be updatable. They need to be defensible. And so part of what the FDA is going to look at, whether you have one product now or a dozen products in the future or 100 products further on down the line, is your metrics. Do your actual patch times match what you told us you were going to do in your cybersecurity management plan? And if you fail to issue timely patches for high-risk vulnerabilities in the field, there are regulatory levers that can be pulled, like recalls. For particularly egregious situations, there's always the possibility of a warning letter as well. So certainly not positions you want to be in if you can avoid it. So I would advise that when you have cybersecurity vulnerabilities that you do need to remediate, you track your own metrics to make sure that you are adhering to what your commitments are. And if you need to sort of adjust what those commitments are in upcoming 510Ks and submissions, you give reasonable and defensible sort of time windows for patching as part of your submissions.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. Next slide here talks a little bit about, in our final sort of content slide, just talking about, getting from compliance to competitive advantage, and a little bit of that bill of materials. Brian, did you want to kick us off on the last slide here?
Sure. And I defined the SBOM a little earlier in the presentation, but we'll just repeat that here. I mean, it's basically inventory of all the software components in your product, and also it ought to also have. There's some debate, but a little depending on your need, it ought to also have the dependencies of those dependencies, or look at those. So information that's typically included in SBOM are the version of the software, the known vulnerabilities, and with the FDA, they also want to see the end support dates. They want to know if the software is still being supported, and when it goes end of life or end of support. And then when you're using these SBOMs. I'm just looking at some of our questions and where we tie them in. So um, you're going to build those in. You're going to use tools like this, like I talked about earlier. We're going to use tools where the SBOMs are going to surface CVEs in the CVE databases. So those tools are going to bring those CVEs to your attention, and then the idea there is that then you can upgrade to newer versions of those dependencies that have resolved those vulnerabilities. Or another alternative is you might find a third-party vendor who has, uh, especially in the case of open source, maybe created a fork of that package in order to fix vulnerabilities, and they'll do that for a fee. And so those are two ways that you might address SBOM findings from third-party packages. And if they're not addressed, then you might have to change your architecture to bring in replacements for those packages. I think we're talking about CI/CD capabilities, and we're also talking about SAST. So you can run these SBOM scans potentially every time you check in your code, or on a nightly basis or on a weekly basis, and that can all be automated with a lot of the uh, tools that are out there like GitHub and GitLab. Some of those can be run on premise like GitLab. And not to mention the Atlassian suite, which is, I think, Bitbucket and Confluence. Um, so then the SaaS side of that, and so SCA is software component analysis, which generates the SBOMs. The SaaS side of that is the static analysis, security testing, and that is where a SaaS tool is going to run the scan against the software code. It analyzes paths through the code, and it ties those back to either CWEs, which are the common weaknesses, or CVEs in some cases. And again, services those so that your developers are aware of them. Even when you have developers who are top, who are very knowledgeable about cybersecurity and do good work. Just like other software development, you miss things. So the scanner's there to help you out, catch everything. Well, catch everything the scanner is capable of catching, not catch all cybersecurity issues. So again, you put this in your CI/CD. Every time you check in code, it could run a SaaS scan and identify new bugs. Sometimes, it just depends on your workflow. If sometimes when you check in code, you want a set of tests that run in a minute, come back with replies. And so the SaaS might not, those SCA and SaaS wouldn't be a good fit if that's your goal, but then you can run them nightly or weekly that serves your workflow.
Thanks, Brian. Nick, any concluding thoughts on this slide?
Yeah, I would just sort of reiterate that, especially with SAST, that absolutely is a technique that penetration testers can use as well. Often in the offensive perspective, it's referred to as reverse engineering. So if we can get our hands on firmware, either from intercepting a download, downloading it directly from a website, or pulling it off of the physical memory on the device, then we'll use those exact same techniques to sort of map out what the software is doing, where we might be able to inject data in order to compromise a device, that kind of thing. So that's definitely a skill set that's useful both on the blue team side, the build side, as well as the break side on penetration testing and red teaming.
Thanks, Nick. Nadeem, any thoughts from you as well?
No, I mean, I more or less concur with both what they said. I mean, this is usually the kind of stuff that goes on in the background before it comes to legal, and if it doesn't come to legal, that means you guys did it right.
Good. Well, that concludes most of our content. What I did want to do is just if the three of you could kind of talk about maybe just one of your, maybe nuggets that you would hope people got out of this webinar. for me, I think, one of the things that Nadeem had said earlier about just, not only thinking about the FDA, but also thinking about, some of the state guidelines as well as the rest of the world. I thought that was a pretty powerful statement. Brian, Nick, and Nadeem, could you maybe give kind of a nugget that you hope people got out of this webinar?
Yeah, I think there's a few, the FDA guidance is a solid resource. And they provide some other solid resources, the MITRE playbook and the SW96 standard. And use that to do your threat modeling early and often. And then I don't know, I'm a big fan of CI/CD automation, so use that to generate your SBOMs and SAST and feed that back into your threat modeling again early and often.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Nadeem and Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one that popped in my head is, what if you're going to take one thing away from what I said, it is early and often echoed in the legal realm, but we call it privacy by design, or privacy and security by design, so that you are taking into account specific regs depending on where you might one day launch from day one. And it's usually that they're not so disparate. It's just making sure you're being deliberate and cracking the different laws in Europe. Europe's got the EU Data Act and the EU AI Act on top of the GDPR and the MDR. And if Europe is one of your main target markets, just paying attention to their guidance, because there's all sorts of new stuff coming out. It seems like every other week in some of these major jurisdictions that would just be an ounce of prevention worth a pound of, an ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure later on, if you're just doing that early at the right design phase.
That's great. Nick?
Yep, I would say my main point is enable your engineers. Most biomedical engineers I've ever worked with get into medical device design to help people. So they're well aware of the things that can go wrong with medical devices. In other contexts, they want their devices to be used to heal rather than hurt. So if you understand why you need to put emphasis on cybersecurity, you give them the resources like the MITRE framework, like processes, like tools. Engineers are going to see the value in that and help you to build that security into the product and into your organization, so that you don't have to take the costly steps of remediating later on. Also, just in general, if you enable early, then your security output is going to be of higher quality than if you're trying to play catch up later.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Once again, we want to say thank you to our sponsor, Pulse Forward. Again, if you have a need in engineering around medical device, Pulse Forward is the place to go. It's pulseforwardbed.com to find out more information. And a big thank you to our three panelists, Nadeem, Nick, and Brian. If you want to get a hold of them, here are their email addresses. And once again, a big thank you to our sponsor, Pulse Forward, and to our panelists, Nick, Nadeem, and Brian. With that, that concludes our webinar on cybersecurity and MedTech. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
All right.